The little village of Briga, tucked between the dry, rocky hills of Castile, had suffered more than its share of misery. Years of drought, sickness, and the constant fear of the Inquisition had worn its people thin, leaving behind only tired survivors. But in the hot summer of 1674, something unusual began when a baby named Eugenia Martínez Vello came into the world. This time, the whispers weren't about God's anger or punishment, but about something far stranger. From the moment she was born, everyone knew she was not like other children. Her cries were louder than the rest, her arms and legs were thicker, and her hunger seemed endless. By the time she turned 1, she no longer fit in her cradle, her soft cheeks puffed up and her heavy body pushing against the tight cloth wrapped around her. Her mother, Maria, often cried as she tried to carry her, her back aching with the effort. The old midwife, her hands shaking as she made the sign of the cross, muttered darkly about curses. Around the village well, people gossiped in hushed voices. "No child like this is natural," they said. Surely God would not create such a thing. Eugenia kept growing, and with her, the rumors grew louder too. Some claimed her bottomless appetite was evil, that she could eat more bread and milk in a day than most men. Others whispered she was a punishment sent from heaven, proof of some secret sin her parents must have hidden. Father Alonso, the local priest, looked at her with the wary gaze of a man faced with a mystery he dared not explain. Her father, Thomas, a bent and weary farmer, carried his shame in silence. He had prayed for a son who could work the land, not a daughter whose very body defied the rules of nature. Yet when his eyes met Eugenia's wide, dark ones, eyes filled with nothing but innocent confusion, his heart ached with love. Whatever others said, she was still his child. But the other children didn't see her that way. They gave her a cruel name, La Monstrua, the monster, and pelted her with stones when she waddled near. Eugenia quickly learned to stay inside, close to the fire, where her mother's worn hands would stroke her hair and whisper shaky words of comfort. "God made you just as you are," Maria would say, though her voice often trembled as if even she wasn't sure. By the time Eugenia turned 6, her body had grown so heavy she could hardly walk without gasping for air. Her skin stretched tight and raw, marked with deep, painful folds where the weight pressed hardest. The village doctor, a man with little skill and less kindness, called her a medical oddity. To him, she was something to be studied, not someone to be healed. So Eugenia's world shrank to the walls of their small cottage, where the firelight cast her rounded shadow on the wall larger, darker, more frightening than she ever meant to be. Outside those walls, the talk spread wider, carried by the dry winds of Castile until it reached places far more powerful than the gossip of peasants. Word of the strange child traveled all the way to the royal court of King Charles II. One day, when the air reeked of burnt wheat from the fields, a horseman in royal colors rode into the village. His fine doublet bore the king's crest, and he dismounted before the Martínez family's home. Villagers gathered in tense silence, their faces pale with both wonder and dread. Thomas stepped forward, wiping his dirt-stained hands on his tunic, his fingers trembling as he took the sealed letter. He had only ever seen such marks in church, on letters from bishops. The village scribe read the words aloud, his voice breaking under the weight of them. By order of His Most Catholic Majesty, Charles II, King of Spain, the child Eugenia Martínez Vello was to be brought to the royal court in Madrid. She was to be shown before the nobles for their study, their curiosity, their amusement. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Maria pulled Eugenia into her arms, clutching her as though she could shield her from the world itself. "No," she whispered, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the horseman's expression did not change. "The will of the king is absolute," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "The child is a marvel of God's creation. His Majesty wishes to see her with his own eyes." Eugenia, her round face red with confusion, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, "What do they want from me?" she asked. Maria could not answer. Her throat closed tight around the words, leaving only silence. The orders came quickly, leaving no time for questions. 2 days later, a carriage rolled into the village, its curtains pulled shut so no one could see inside. The people of Briga gathered in silence as Eugenia was dressed for the journey. The seamstress had thrown together a gown of rough wool, dyed a faded blue, its seams straining against her heavy frame. Her dark hair, usually loose, was pinned flat under a stiff linen cap. "Be strong," her father whispered, his throat tight with grief. He pressed a small wooden cross into her hand, his calloused fingers shaking. "God will walk with you." Eugenia's lips trembled, but she nodded, too young to understand why she had to leave, only that her parents' eyes were full of tears. The road to Madrid was long and harsh. Dust poured in through the cracks, the wheels jolted over stones, and the air inside the carriage grew hot and suffocating. Eugenia's body ached from the motion. Her skin rubbed raw against the stiff fabric of her new dress. The man in charge, Don Alvaro, hardly spoke except to bark orders. "Sit still," he snapped when she shifted in discomfort. "You are not some whining peasant. You are to be displayed." At inns along the way, she was hidden in shadowy rooms, locked away so no travelers could see the king's prize too soon. Her food was brought by quiet servants who refused to look her in the eye. One night, she overheard 2 maids whispering outside the door. "They say she weighs as much as an ox." Poor girl. Do you think she knows what's coming? Eugenia clutched the wooden cross and stayed awake until morning. When Madrid's spires finally pierced the horizon, her stomach turned. The city was a monster of noise, filth, and smoke, so unlike the quiet hills of home. The carriage passed golden crests on the gates and guards in shining breastplates until they entered a palace, courtyard of white stone and glittering glass. Don Alvaro flung open the door. "Out," he barked. "And mind yourself. You are here to be seen, not to speak." Eugenia stumbled as she stepped down, the eyes of silk-draped courtiers snapping toward her. Their jeweled fans stilled mid-wave, their whispers sharpened like knives. One man in a powdered wig leaned toward his companion, grinning. "So this is the monstrous child. What a sight!" Eugenia's fingers closed tighter around the cross until the wood bit into her skin. Somewhere beyond the giant doors, the king was waiting, and with him a fate she could not imagine. The great hall of the Alcazar swallowed her whole. Candles burned in tall holders, their flames reflecting off gold and polished marble. The air was heavy with the sweet smell of roses and beeswax, making her dizzy. She stood barefoot on the thick carpet, feeling its softness give way beneath her weight. A half-circle of nobles glittered around her, their silk swishing like restless wings. A woman with a tower of lace on her head covered her mouth and giggled. "Look at her like a barrel on legs." Eugenia's cheeks burned hot, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. The cross dug deeper into her palm, the only piece of home she had left. At the far end, under a canopy of blood-red velvet, sat King Charles II. His skin was pale, his jaw heavy and crooked, his body weak from illness, but his dark eyes gleamed with curiosity. He raised one bony hand. "Bring her to me," he ordered, his voice thin but sharp. Don Alvaro jabbed her with the tip of his boot, pushing her forward. She stumbled, and laughter rolled through the crowd. "Careful," one noble shouted. "She shattered the floor." The hall rang with cruel laughter, but the king ignored them. He leaned forward in his gilded chair, his lips curling. "Turn," he commanded. Eugenia froze, her heart hammering. "Turn!" Don Alvaro hissed, spinning her roughly by the shoulder. Gasps and delighted cries burst from the nobles. A bishop in bright embroidered robes clapped his hands. "Such a wonder!" he exclaimed. "Surely this is either God's blessing or his cruelest joke." Eugenia's eyes blurred with tears as the room spun around her. She could feel every eye in the room burning into her, crawling over her body as if she were some strange object on display. Their gazes lingered on her round belly, her heavy arms, and the way her dress strained against her figure. A man with a feather in his hat quickly scribbled her outline on a piece of parchment, twisting her shape into something ugly and cartoonish. "Does she dance?" a duchess asked sweetly, though her voice carried a sharp cruelty beneath it. Before Eugenia could answer, a fiddler struck up a tune, and the nobles clapped in rhythm, their smiles cutting like knives. "Go on then," someone called. "Show us how the peasants celebrate." Her eyes stung with tears, but she forced her feet to move. She swayed clumsily, her arms jerking about as she tried to keep her balance. The laughter grew louder, a harsh wall of sound that made her want to sink into the floor. A sugared almond flew through the air, smacking her cheek before rolling across the tiles. Just as the noise reached its peak, a tired voice cut through. "That's enough." It wasn't the king but Queen Mariana, her lined face weary and stern. For a brief moment, silence hung in the hall until Charles II lifted his hand with a dismissive flick. "Nonsense," he said flatly. "The girl entertains me." He turned to a servant. "Bring food. I want to see how much she can eat." Almost at once, a heavy table groaned under the weight of roasted meats, sticky pastries, and jugs of wine. The crowd pressed closer, eager to watch. "Eat," the king ordered, his words falling like a challenge. Eugenia's stomach twisted with dread. Back home she had always known hunger, her body swelling even as food was scarce. But here, food wasn't kindness, it was a weapon, another way to mock her. Her trembling fingers reached for a piece of bread. The moment she bit into it, the room erupted in cheers. Like a pig at the trough. One man crowed, and the hall roared with laughter. She chewed slowly, the bread turning dry and tasteless in her mouth. The queen's gaze met hers for a fleeting second, pity flickering in her eyes before she looked away. When the table was finally empty, the king yawned. "Take her away. We'll have her again tomorrow." As guards led her out, whispers swirled behind her like biting winds. "Did you see how she gorged? Nothing but appetite. How marvelous." Eugenia clenched the wooden cross in her palm until it pierced her skin. That night, alone in the tiny chamber they had given her, more cell than room, she buried her face in the scratchy straw mattress and cried. Outside, the moon spread its pale light over the palace walls. Somewhere within those endless corridors, a painter sharpened his quill, already preparing to capture the king's new amusement. And so her days began to blur into a cruel routine. She was no longer treated like a person, but as a living curiosity, a thing to laugh at, a marvel to be picked apart piece by piece. The court's curiosity hardened into a hunger for more, always more. On the third morning, a servant arrived and threw a bundle of lace and silk onto her cot. "You'll wear this," he said carelessly. She unfolded the garments and found a parody of court fashion. The dress strained before she even tried it on, its bodice laced so tightly she could barely breathe. When she stepped into the hall, the nobles burst out laughing. "Look at her wrapped in satin." Someone jeered. The king leaned lazily on his throne, smirking. "Now dance again, monster," he said. This time, they had prepared a stage in the center of the hall, polished so smooth it shone like glass. Eugenia climbed a step slowly, her legs shaking. The fiddler launched into a wild tune, and the crowd clapped along, their eyes sparkling with cruel delight. She moved as best she could, swaying with effort, sweat dripping down her face. The laughter grew sharper. A handful of rose petals was tossed, sticking to her damp skin like mock jewelry. "Faster!" someone shouted. Her foot slipped. She crashed onto the wooden floor with a thud that rattled the stage. Pain shot through her knees, but the roar of laughter drowned out her gasp. "Bravo, a perfect ending!" Voices cried, clapping louder. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Eugenia pushed herself up, her fingers gripping the wooden floor for balance. The king leaned back, a smirk curling across his lips as he ordered, "Again." And so it went, day after day, each command more humiliating than the last. By the end of the week, they dressed her in armor so small it cut into her skin, mocking her as the fat knight while jabbing her with sticks as she stumbled across the hall. Another time, they forced her to balance on a stool while gestures pretended to knock her off, the courtiers roaring with laughter every time she wobbled. One night, they dragged out a huge iron scale with heavy chains, and a duke shouted for her to climb on. With her cheeks burning, Eugenia obeyed. The needle swung wildly as someone bellowed, 400 at least. A true giant of flesh. The courtiers gasped in mock wonder, their eyes shining with cruel delight. The queen, silent as always, turned her face away. The worst came during the feast of St. John. The palace glowed with torches, the air filled with music and the smell of roasted meat. Instead of the hall, they led Eugenia to the gardens where a great fountain had been drained and filled with red wine that shimmered, like blood in the firelight. "Tonight, our monster shall bathe," the king announced, and the crowd broke into laughter and cheers. Eugenia's stomach twisted. She had lost her little wooden cross long ago. Now she had nothing to hold on to but her shaky breath. "Go on," a countess cooed. "Surely you've never tasted such a fine vintage." When she hesitated, the king's voice cracked with irritation. "Must I command you twice?" Rough hands shoved her forward, her feet splashing in the sticky liquid. The wine rose to her waist as voices shouted, "Drink! Let's see if she floats." She closed her eyes, letting the sound of their laughter pound against her ears. The wine soaked her hair, her dress, her skin, even filling her mouth with its bitter sting. When they finally dragged her out, dripping and shivering, the king clapped. "Magnificent," he declared, as if she were a trick animal. That night, in her tiny stone cell, Eugenia scrubbed her skin until it was raw, but the sour smell of wine clung to her. The walls echoed with drunken singing from the feast outside, but she pressed her forehead against the cold stone, wishing she could hear her parents' voices instead. Somewhere far away, maybe they still whispered her name. Here, she was nothing. Here, she was only the spectacle. At dawn, a page boy with ink-stained fingers rattled the iron latch of her door. "Up, Monstrua," he sneered, tossing a scrap of parchment onto her straw bed. "The king commands you to the portrait gallery." Her body ached from the night before, her knees still sore from her falls, the sticky wine drying on her skin. But saying no was impossible. The portrait gallery stretched long and tall, lined with paintings of kings and queens whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every step. At the far end stood a thin man in a paint-stained doublet, tapping his fingers impatiently on an easel. "At last the subject arrives," he said sharply. "I am Don Sebastian de Herrera, painter to His Majesty. You will sit as I instruct." Eugenia froze, unsure what to do. A noblewoman nearby fluttered her fan and laughed. "Oh, how amusing. The creature thinks she has a choice." Don Sebastian motioned toward a raised platform covered with heavy cloth. "Climb up and do not move once you are in place." The platform groaned beneath Eugenia's weight as she settled on it. The painter circled her slowly, studying her like a butcher sizing up meat. "Turn your face to the light," he ordered. "No, chin up. Let them see the fullness." Eugenia obeyed, her hands tightening in her lap. Around her, nobles gathered, their whispers slipping through the hall like snakes, every word reminding her she was no longer seen as a girl, only as a spectacle. "Do you think he'll show her the way she looks, or twist her into something even worse?" One noble joked, leaning close to his friend. The other chuckled, shaking his head. "Her real self is bad enough." At the front of the gallery, Don Sebastian dipped his brush into a thick glob of color and dragged it across the canvas with quick, cutting strokes. He wasn't painting her as a girl, not even as a person. To him, she was nothing but a strange object, something to be captured and mocked forever. "Don't move," he barked when Eugenia shifted in her seat. "Unless you want to be remembered as a blurry disgrace." She froze, her back stiff and aching, her breath shallow as the painter's sharp eyes darted from her body to his canvas. His mouth twisted in irritation. "More," he muttered. "Show them more of the folds, the weight, the proof of God's mistake." A servant brought in fruit and wine, and the nobles nibbled as if they were watching a play. "Will he paint the way her dress looks ready to tear?" a duchess asked with a cruel laugh. "Of course," the painter said flatly. "Every single flaw." Eugenia let her gaze slip to a crack in the far wall, trying to imagine herself back in Bruges, hearing the dry wind through the olive trees, smelling the smoke of her mother's cooking. For a moment, she almost escaped. Then a loud clap snapped her back. "That's enough for today," Don Sebastian announced, wiping his hands on a rag. Eugenia's legs were numb as she climbed down from the platform. A page boy hurried forward, grinning. "The king wants to see how it looks." With a flourish, the painter turned the canvas around. A gasp ran through the crowd. The painting showed Eugenia, larger than life, her face dull with suffering, her body blown up into a grotesque parody. Every curve, every crease had been stretched into something monstrous. "Magnificent," the king said softly, running his fingers along the frame. A masterpiece of strangeness. Eugenia's throat closed. This was how she would be remembered, not as a daughter, not as a person, but as a cruel joke hanging on a wall. Applause rang out, and she turned her head, catching her warped reflection in a golden mirror. The girl staring back at her didn't look human. She looked broken, something to laugh at. And the worst part was that the painting wasn't even finished. Day after day, she was dragged back to pose again. Hours of stillness, hours of the painter's brush scratching across the canvas as he demanded, "Tilt your head. No down. Let the light show the heaviness." Her body ached from holding positions, but the nobles kept coming, bringing their guests to watch. It had become their favorite form of entertainment. "Remarkable," a visiting diplomat whispered, peering at her like she was a beast in a cage. "I've seen dwarfs and giants, but this is something else." Don Sebastian smirked, his eyes never leaving his work. A triumph of nature's cruelty. Eugenia gripped the fabric beneath her hands, trying to keep herself from trembling. She had taught herself to drift away in her mind when it got too much, but this time something pulled her back. A little girl stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her mother's skirts. She couldn't have been older than 5, the same age Eugenia had been when the village children first mocked her. The girl's eyes were wide, not with wonder, but with fear. "Mama," she whispered too loudly, "is she going to eat me?" The room broke into laughter. Eugenia's breath caught in her chest. The mother smoothed her daughter's hair and answered, "No, darling. She's just a curiosity. A thing to look at. Nothing more." Those words sank into Eugenia's bones, colder than stone. That night, lying in her cell with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, she realized the truth. Here, she was not a person at all. She was only the spectacle. The sharp smell of paint still clung to her skin, reminding her of the long hours she had just endured. Outside, the palace was quiet except for the slow, steady steps of guards patrolling the grounds. She turned onto her side, the straw mattress crunching beneath her, rough against her cheek. For a brief moment, with her eyes closed, she pretended she was back home in Bruges, curled on the small cot near her mother's fire. But the illusion broke the instant her hand brushed her own stomach, round and heavy, her arms thick beside her. "This is what I've become," she thought, and the realization stabbed at her like a knife. The next morning, the final sitting began. Don Sebastian stood at his easel, working with a feverish energy as if the figure before him might suddenly vanish. "Almost finished," he muttered, more to himself than to her. just the eyes. The soul of the work. The word made her flinch. Soul? Does he really think I have one? He leaned close, his eyes sharp. Look at me, he ordered. Not like some scared animal. Show me that you understand what you are. The words slipped from her mouth before she could stop them. And what am I? The gallery fell still. Even the nobles paused their chatter to hear his reply. His lip curled. You are a curiosity of nature, a joke God decided to play. Something to stare at, then forget. He dipped his brush into black paint. Now don't move. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She stared straight ahead as his brush scratched across the canvas one last time. Then, with a deep sigh, he set it down. Finished, the nobles rushed forward, their voices rising in excitement. Amazing, one gasped. She looks even more foolish here than in person. The king himself stepped up, tracing the edge of the frame with pale fingers. Hang it in the Hall of Wonders, he commanded. Let visitors see Spain's marvel for themselves. Eugenia stepped down slowly, her legs stiff, her body trembling. No one noticed her anymore. Their attention belonged entirely to the painting. She caught a quick glimpse of it as a servant shoved her toward the door. It was her, but twisted into something monstrous, her body made enormous, her face blank and hollow. Only her eyes looked alive, filled with pain the painter hadn't meant to capture. A guard barked at her to move. Off you go, Monstrua. You're no longer needed. As she was pushed into the dim corridor, the applause of the court still rang behind her. Somewhere the painter cleaned his brushes, proud of his creation. And deep inside, the small spark of hope she had held onto was gone. She knew now she would never be remembered as a person, only as a cruel joke. Later, the great hall blazed with candlelight, every flame bouncing off golden mirrors and shining cups. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the thick sweetness of sugared almonds. Nobles in velvet and lace laughed behind jeweled fans, their voices rising in a polished chorus of mockery. Eugenia stood at the edge, wrapped in a dress that mocked her even more. It was made of velvet and pearls, but stitched so tight she could barely breathe. A servant had spent hours dressing her, pulling and pinning as if she were a lifeless doll. There, the woman had said with a smirk. Now you look like a true lady. The words had stung worse than any slap. A tap on her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see the Duchess of Alba, her face powdered pale, her lips stretched into a smile that never touched her eyes. My dear, what a sight you are tonight, the Duchess said sweetly. Thank you, Your Grace, Eugenia murmured, the words automatic, hollow. The woman's gaze slid over her figure, pausing on the fabric stretched tight across her hips. Tell me, she asked with a laugh, do they feed you more for nights like this, or is the fun in watching you nearly pop from your seams? A baroness nearby covered her mouth, giggling behind her fan. The courtiers snickered, some even whispering wagers about which seam of her gown would rip first. Eugenia pressed her nails into her palms until they stung, reminding herself that staying quiet was the only way to survive nights like this. At the king's table, Charles II lifted his hand. The room hushed instantly. Bring the scale, he ordered, his lips curling with amusement. Two servants rolled forward a massive brass scale, polished so brightly it glowed under the candlelight. Eugenia's stomach twisted. She had endured this before being weighed like an animal at a market, while the nobles leaned in, waiting to mock her. Step forward, Monstrua, the king called, his voice heavy with fake kindness. She moved slowly, each step loud against the marble floor. A great scale groaned under her weight as she climbed onto it. The needle swung before settling. 420 pounds, the herald announced. Gasps and laughter erupted. Incredible! She grows faster than a fattened calf, shouted one man, his breath sour with wine. Another leaned close, smirking. Tell us, do you feel every pound when you walk? or does it feel like carrying a whole kingdom? Eugenia clenched her jaw and stared straight ahead. The king waved his hand. Enough. Let the feast begin. The tables filled with roasted pig, sweet marzipan, and overflowing goblets of spiced wine. A servant guided Eugenia to a special heavy chair at her own table, a cruel throne built so everyone could watch her. Meraki, a courtier with a wicked smile, shoved a tray of pastries toward her. "Go on, enjoy yourself," he urged. The nobles leaned in eagerly, waiting. When she picked up a tart and bit into it, the crowd broke into applause. "Marvelous! She eats like a queen," someone shouted. "Yes, a queen of gluttony," another added. The honey filling coated her tongue, too sweet, making her stomach churn. Their laughter swirled around her like a storm. Then a new voice rose above the noise. "Your Majesty," it called. The crowd turned to see a young nobleman, dressed plainly compared to the others, bowing low. Charles waved lazily for him to continue. The man lifted his goblet. "To Spain's greatest wonder. So vast, so glorious, she outshines even our grandest statues." The hall exploded with cheers and clinking goblets. Eugenia's face burned hot, her hands shaking beneath the table. But the man smirked, pressing on. And to think, she was once a peasant girl. Now she feasts with kings. What luck! His words dripped with mockery, and the laughter grew sharper. At last, the queen placed her fork down with a soft clink. "That is enough," she murmured, barely above a whisper. But the king only chuckled. "Nonsense, my dear. She is here for their fun." A servant bent over Eugenia's shoulder and refilled her cup. "Drink," he whispered. "It will help." She raised the glass, her hand trembling, the deep red wine spilling at the rim. Around her, the nobles had turned to other distractions, a jester tumbling, a poet spouting dirty verses, but their eyes kept darting back to her, hungry for the next joke. As the hours dragged on, the jokes grew crueler. "I heard she was born from a cow and a mountain." One voice called. "No, no, she's the lost daughter of a giant." Another shouted. Eugenia's vision blurred, the hundreds of candles splitting into dizzying doubles, their flames laughing at her. Suddenly, a strong hand clamped onto her arm. Don Alvaro leaned close, his voice sharp. "Up! The king commands you to dance." The musicians struck up a lively tune as the nobles circled eagerly. Eugenia rose, her legs shaky. "Go on," a duchess prodded with a smile that was nothing but teeth. "Show us how a lady moves." The first step made her knees scream with pain, the second nearly toppled her. By the third, her head spun so wildly that the faces around her blurred into a wall of jeering mouths. Then it happened. Her foot snagged on the hem of her suffocating gown. She stumbled forward, arms flailing. The fall seemed endless, every heartbeat stretched thin, until she struck the floor with a heavy thud. For a breath, the room was silent. And then, like a wave breaking, the shrieks of laughter crashed over her, echoing through the glittering hall. Eugenia lay sprawled on the cold floor, her cheek pressed against the stone as laughter thundered around her. "Did you see that tumble?" Someone shouted, and the court burst into applause as if her humiliation were a grand performance. The queen lowered her face behind a fan, hiding her discomfort, while the king laughed so hard he wiped at his watering eyes. Servants rushed to haul Eugenia back to her feet, their hands gripping too tightly, their voices dripping with scorn. She caught a glimpse of herself in a polished silver platter, her gown torn, hair undone, cheeks flushed red. What stared back was not a girl in fine clothes, but a spectacle. In that reflection, she saw herself as they did, a monster dressed up for mockery. The jeers followed her down the corridor as she was dragged back to her chamber. The servant escorting her dug his fingers into her arm like he was steering an animal rather than a person. Once the heavy door shut behind her, Eugenia sagged against the wall, gasping for air. The dress squeezed her like a trap, every seam biting into her skin. With shaking hands, she tore at the laces until the fabric loosened and slid down, pooling at her feet like shed skin. She stood trembling in the dim light, the chill of the stone floor rising through her bare solace. Enough, she thought. They had ridiculed her, weighed her, dressed her like a doll, forced her to dance until she fell. She couldn't take more. But she also refused to break. Her rebellion started in silence. The next morning, a tray of bread, cheese, and sweet figs was placed before her, meant to stuff her until she became even more of a curiosity. Eugenia left it untouched. By evening, the bread had gone hard and the cheese dry. The servant who collected the tray frowned. "You didn't eat." She said nothing. The next day was the same, and the day after that. Each morning the meals grew larger, richer, more tempting, as if they were testing her will. Still, she turned away. "The king won't like this," the servant warned, narrowing his eyes. For the first time, Eugenia met his gaze. "Then let him be angry," she whispered. The servant froze, startled that the so-called monster could speak with such quiet strength. The change carried into the painter's hall. Don Sebastian summoned her, eager to pose her beside a dwarf and a bearded lady, like some twisted gallery of oddities. But Eugenia planted her feet on the ground. "I won't stand there," she said calmly. His face darkened, his hand twitching toward the thin switch at his belt. "Defy me, and the king will hear of it," he snarled. Eugenia crossed her arms. "Then let him hear. Beat me if you must, but I will not climb that platform." The nobles gasped at her boldness. No one had ever told the court no. Don Sebastian's fingers wrapped around the switch, ready to strike, but after a long pause, he spat on the floor instead. "Fine, but you'll regret this." That night her punishment arrived. Instead of the usual feast, her tray held nothing but a crust of bread and a cup of water. The servant smirked as he set it down. "His Majesty says if you refuse to eat like a lady, then you'll eat like a beggar." Eugenia took the crust in silence. Dry and tasteless, it still felt like a victory, because the choice to eat or not was hers. Her strength was tested again during a royal parade in the gardens. The king ordered her to walk beside his carriage, parading her through the heat like a prized animal. The sun beat down and her heavy gown stuck to her skin as courtiers laughed, whispering behind jeweled fans. Halfway through, the king leaned from his carriage window, his eyes glittering with malice. "Kiss the dirt, Monstrua. Show us how grateful you are." Eugenia stopped walking. The crowd hushed, waiting for her to obey. The king's carriage moved only a short distance before he noticed Eugenia was no longer walking behind. His face turned crimson as he whipped around, eyes blazing. "Why are you standing still?" he barked. Eugenia lifted her head and answered firmly, "I heard you." The crowd stirred, whispers rolling through them like a breeze through dry leaves. The queen, sitting stiffly at his side, reached for his arm and murmured, "Leave it be." But the king's pride was wounded, and his voice dripped with fury. "You will bend to the ground," he ordered. Eugenia didn't look away. Instead of dropping to her knees, she crouched and gently picked a small flower growing beside the path. Rising again, she spun the fragile stem slowly between her fingers, holding it like a secret treasure. The king's lips curled into a snarl. "Seize her!" he thundered. 2 guards rushed forward and gripped her arms, but she made no attempt to fight them. She simply let the flower slip from her hand, its petals drifting away in the warm air until they scattered on the dirt. That night, locked in her dark chamber, she leaned against the door and strained to hear the guards outside. Their voices carried faintly through the wood. "The king's beside himself with rage," one muttered. The other scoffed. What did he expect? Even an animal turns when pushed too far. In the darkness, Eugenia's lips curved into a quiet smile. Her defiance was small, almost invisible, but it was hers alone. For the first time in years, something stirred inside her, a faint spark of strength that felt ready to grow into flame. Time drifted by like slow-moving shadows crawling across the palace walls. The nobles, always greedy for new amusements, soon grew tired of her. Once she had been their cruelest joke, their prized oddity. Now fresher distractions stole their attention. A calf with 2 heads from the countryside, fire eaters from faraway lands, even a pair of twin sisters who sang in perfect harmony. Eugenia was forgotten, shoved aside into a cold, drafty room deep in the servants' wing, far from the bright halls where she had once been paraded for laughter. Her new world was stripped of any comfort. The walls sweated with dampness, her thin straw mattress sagged beneath her weight, and tiny lice scurried in the cracks. No more silks or velvet touched her skin, only rough, loose cloth that hung from her frame. The endless feasts of her past were gone too. Now she was fed bowls of watery gruel, chunks of stale bread that scratched her throat, and now and then a shred of stringy meat. Many nights she pressed her hands against her belly, surprised by how much smaller she had become. She was still heavy, still set apart, but the bulk that once made her a spectacle had melted into something less shocking, less monstrous. Her only companions were the rats. At night their tiny claws tapped softly across the stone floor as they searched for crumbs. She didn't mind them. In fact, she welcomed their presence. They were quiet, simple creatures, and in their way, they treated her with more respect than the nobles ever had. One evening, as Eugenia sat breaking apart a crust of dry bread, the door creaked open. A small kitchen maid slipped inside, barely 12 years old. Her apron was streaked with soot, and her flushed cheeks shone from the heat of the ovens. In her small hand she carried a wedge of cheese. She pressed it quickly into Eugenia's palm and whispered, "The cook won't notice this is gone." Eugenia froze, staring at the offering. Her throat tightened. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked quietly. The girl shrugged. "You looked hungry." The words cut deeper than any insult, because they held kindness, a kindness Eugenia had not felt in years. Slowly, almost reverently, she lifted the cheese to her mouth and savored each bite as though it were a feast. The maid lingered in the doorway, her big eyes filled with questions. "Did you really dance for the king once?" she asked. Eugenia's hands fell still. "Yes," she said at last. "I did. Was it wonderful?" The girl pressed eagerly. Eugenia let out a rough laugh, sharp and bitter. "No, it was not wonderful." The child frowned, confused, as if trying to connect the haggard woman before her with the stories whispered in the palace halls. "They say you could eat an entire pig all by yourself," she said. Eugenia set the last crumb of cheese aside and shook her head. "People say many things," she muttered softly. Far away, a bell rang, calling the palace to evening prayers. The girl jumped, startled, and stepped back. "I have to go," she said quickly, then paused at the door. "I can bring you more tomorrow if you'd like." Eugenia gave a small nod, though in her heart she doubted the child would return. Promises in the palace were light as air, easy to give, easier to forget. But to her surprise, the very next day, the little maid came back. The little maid kept slipping into Eugenia's room day after day, carrying whatever scraps she could hide away. Sometimes it was a hard crust of bread, sometimes a lump of cheese, and once she even brought a ribbon she'd stolen, which she tied carefully around Eugenia's wrist as if it were a medal. One afternoon she leaned close and whispered, "No one speaks of you anymore. The king hasn't even said your name in months." Eugenia ran her finger along the rim of her wooden bowl and gave a tired half-smile. "That's just the way I want it," she said. The girl frowned. "Don't you care about being remembered?" Eugenia lifted her gaze and shook her head. "Not if the memory is only full of their cruelty." The child bit her lip, hesitating before asking softly, "Then what do you wish people would remember you for?" Eugenia had no answer, and the silence between them said everything. The years crept forward. The scullery maid grew taller and busier until her visits became rare, then stopped altogether. Eugenia didn't hold it against her. The girl had her own burdens to carry, her own life to live. Alone again, Eugenia spent her days sitting by the narrow window slit, watching the courtyard below. She saw servants rushing to and fro, noblemen riding out to hunt, and the occasional traveler bringing strange stories from faraway places. Life outside went on without her, moving like a river that no longer touched her banks. One afternoon, a new painting was hung in the Hall of Curiosities, this one of a golden lion with its mane flying and its teeth bared in a furious snarl. The courtiers gasped and cheered over the artist's skill, crowding to admire the beast. No one bothered to glance at the older works, especially not the faded portrait shoved into the darkest corner, a swollen, hollow-eyed figure of Eugenia that now gathered dust. She was forgotten, both on the wall and in the palace halls. Then came the winter, sharp and merciless. Cold air cut through the cracks of her tiny room until it settled deep into her bones. She coughed often, the sound rattling off the stone walls, but no healer was ever called. No one even asked about her. On the harshest night of the year, with the wind crying through the walls like a grieving ghost, Eugenia curled beneath her thin blanket. Somewhere far away, the king roared with laughter at some new amusement. Somewhere, a painter dipped his brush for his next marvel. And somewhere, hidden in a forgotten chamber of the palace, a woman who had once been a spectacle let out her final shaky breath. No one cried. No one lit a candle. In the morning, a servant discovered her lifeless body. He muttered a quick prayer, crossed himself, and went to fetch the gravedigger. "Who is she?" the gravedigger asked as they wrapped her in plain cloth. The servant shrugged without looking up. Nobody of importance, and with that, Eugenia Martínez was lowered into an unmarked grave, her name already fading from memory, as fleeting as the cruel gossip that had once filled the palace halls. The court moved on without pause, and history prepared to erase her completely. In her final days, though, one man had come. A painter appeared in her doorway, carrying his easel under one arm, his face unreadable. "I've been ordered to paint you," he said quietly. Eugenia did not stir from her cot. "For what purpose?" she asked. His fingers tightened on the wooden frame. The king gave the command. Eugenia's breath fogged in the freezing air as she let out a weary sigh. "Of course. Even dying, I'm still a showpiece." The painter unpacked his brushes carefully, arranging them in silence. Unlike Don Sebastian, he did not prod her or mock her. He simply studied her with steady eyes, setting to work with the patience of long practice. "You don't need to rise," he murmured at last. "Stay just as you are." Eugenia closed her eyes, her body no longer the strange wonder it had once been. The heavy flesh that had made her famous now sagged loosely on her bones, her frame frail and worn by sickness. The painter's brush moved slowly and gently across the canvas, his strokes deliberate, never rushed. After a while, Eugenia whispered, "What is your name?" The brush stopped mid-air. "Louis," he said softly. She opened her eyes just enough to meet his. "And do you paint many monsters, Louis?" He held her gaze, firm and calm. "I don't paint monsters," he replied. "I paint people." The painter's quiet words hung heavy in the air, like a blanket that smothered every sound. For hours, the only noise in the room was the soft scratch of his brush sliding across the canvas, broken now and then by faint footsteps echoing down the hallway outside. Louis worked without speaking, his movements calm and careful, so different from the harsh cruelty that usually filled this place. As the daylight outside began to fade, he finally lowered his brush and said gently, "It's finished." Eugenia didn't ask to see it. She didn't need to. She already knew what the painting would show: a woman beaten down by years of ridicule, her eyes empty with sadness, her life remembered only as a cruel joke. Louis packed his paints and tools slowly, each movement deliberate, as though he didn't want the moment to end. At the door, he hesitated and looked back. "People won't forget you," he whispered. Eugenia turned away, pressing her cheek to the cold wall. "No," she said softly. "They'll only remember the monster they decided I was." The door shut with a quiet click, and the wind outside howled against the stone walls. Alone in the fading light, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo waited for her final breath. The painting was placed in the Hall of Curiosities, another oddity among stuffed beasts and strange relics. Visitors glanced at it briefly, muttering half-forgotten stories, before moving on to the next wonder. But in her small, dark chamber, away from the eyes of strangers, she was no longer a spectacle, just a tired girl, unseen at last. Maybe that was the only mercy life left her. The portrait stayed on display for years, collecting dust beside a two-headed calf preserved in glass, and the stuffed skin of a lion that some claimed had once belonged to a saint. Nobles strolled past, wrinkling their noses at the grotesque figure painted there. Who could she have been? One young lady in a fine silk gown asked as she leaned in closer. Her companion, a man with a powdered wig and an air of boredom, snapped open his fan. "Some peasant girl," he said carelessly. "The king kept her as entertainment. Fed her until she could hardly stand. People laughed at her once. The lady gave a nervous laugh. How dreadful. And they called this art? A record of nature's mistakes," the man replied, steering her away toward a glittering goblet said to have once belonged to King Solomon himself. Years slipped by. Wars began and ended. Kings fell and new rulers rose. Empires crumbled while others grew strong. The Hall of Curiosities was eventually taken apart, its treasures scattered to collectors in storerooms where few cared to look. Eugenia's portrait passed from hand to hand, each new owner caring less about the woman in the frame than the shock value it brought to their guests. It became nothing more than a dark conversation piece. In a cramped study in Madrid, a historian adjusted his spectacles and peered closely at the canvas. "Remarkable," he murmured to his assistant. "A perfect example of how the Baroque age delighted in the grotesque. See how the body is exaggerated to make you feel both pity and disgust." The young assistant frowned. But was she a real person? The historian shrugged, already making notes in his ledger. If she was, she mattered little. At most, she was a passing amusement for the court. The painting was catalogued, given a number, and stored away. Its label was cold and detached. Portrait of an obese female subject. Artist unknown. 17th century. No name, no story. Just another oddity filed away by history. And yet, far from the palace in the quiet village of Brihuega, where dry grass rustled in the wind and olive trees bent in the summer heat, someone still remembered. An old woman with trembling hands knelt in the churchyard, tracing her fingers over a faded stone. The words were long erased, but she didn't need them. She whispered softly, "Eugenia, I remember you." The scullery maid, now gray-haired, frail, and bent with age, laid a single wildflower on the forgotten grave. Somewhere beyond time's reach, a girl once laughed in the sunshine. But the world had already moved on. The cruelty of turning people into spectacles never dies with the audience. Long after the laughter fades and the crowds are gone, the echo remains in the silence of forgotten names, in the way history erases lives it once mocked. Centuries passed. The Alcazar crumbled, was rebuilt, and fell again. And Eugenia's story, like so many others, was folded away in the pages of time. Over the years, the faces of kings and queens faded into stories, and Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, the girl once mocked as La Monstrua, was pushed into the shadows of history. In dusty records, she was nothing more than a strange note, remembered only as a joke in the games of royalty. Some doubted she had even lived. Was she a real girl, or just a warning tale meant to scare people about greed and excess. The few paintings of her that remained were studied by experts, but not for who she was. Instead, they praised the way the artist exaggerated her shape, or how the light and shadows made her look larger, stranger, less human. Almost no one asked about the real girl behind those painted eyes. In one lecture hall, a professor projected her portrait onto a big white screen. The students shuffled in their seats, some laughed quietly, others looked away in discomfort. The professor pointed with his stick and said, "This is a perfect example of how the Baroque era was obsessed with anything unusual or different. Notice how the painter strips away her humanity, turning her into an object instead of a person." A student raised a hand. "Do we know what became of her?" The professor sighed. "No one's certain. She probably didn't live very long. In those times, people like her rarely did." Then the topic shifted, and her name slipped away again. In another part of Spain, a mother pulled her child's hand back from a plate of sweets. "Don't eat too much," she warned sharply. "You'll turn out like the monster." The word rolled off her tongue easily, as if it were nothing more than a family saying. That was what the story had become, just a cruel joke used to scare children, stripped of any trace of the girl who once lived. And yet, not everyone forgot. In a quiet gallery, a young artist stumbled across her portrait shoved into a corner. At first glance, it seemed small and overlooked compared to the grand paintings that surrounded it. But the girl's eyes stopped her cold. She returned the next day, and the day after that, sketching the face over and over in her notebook. There was something in those painted eyes, not only pain, but strength and a stubbornness that still whispered through time. She wasn't just an exhibit. She was someone trying to be heard. In Madrid, during a late-night poetry slam, a woman stood under the spotlight with trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she recited. They named her a monster, but who gave them the right? They stuffed her full, then laughed when she split. Tell me, who are the real monsters here? The audience fell silent. No one dared to clap or laugh. Far away, in the town of Brihuega, a group of schoolchildren gathered near an ivy-covered plaque that had been placed on the churchyard wall. The stone was worn, the letters faint, but the words were clear enough. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, 1674 to 1690. She was a child. For the first time, her name was remembered in stone, not hidden in whispers. Her story was not carried forward by the cruel laughter of those who mocked her, but by those who chose to honor her. By the artist who saw her humanity in a forgotten portrait. By the poet who gave her back her voice. By the children who spoke her name aloud after centuries of silence. The truth is simple. Eugenia was never the monster. The monsters were the ones who made her suffer and turned her life into a show.